A computer programming language is much like a human communication language. A human communication language has vocabulary, words that mean specific things. We have grammar. Those are the rules that define how words interact with each other. We have sentences that can be formed from the vocabulary and the grammar, and those sentences then can be used in larger blocks known as paragraphs. Somebody who hasn't mastered the language can still communicate because there's lots of leeway in understanding that language. And somebody may actually communicate very succinctly, perhaps in poetry, but we may interpret that differently. And of course, there's lots of ways of saying the same thing. In a computer programming language such as Python, we don't have vocabulary, rather we refer to specific words as keywords. Things like print, input, int, format are keywords. And those keywords often have syntax associated with them. And that syntax is usually part of a statement. And a statement are going to be keywords with maybe parameters and things that we add in, such as literal strings, that form a statement. And sometimes those statements can be larger blocks of statements, such as the fork of an if structure. We sometimes refer to those as structures. Now here's one thing where it's really different in computer programming language, and that is the language is very exact. There is no leeway in interpreting because the computer is going to do the interpretation. And the computer is developed to interpret our statements in only one way. So if we leave out a comma somewhere, or we forget to put a quote, or we put an extra quote, we're going to get errors because it doesn't match what the computer's expecting in terms of that exact syntax and exact statements. However, just as there's lots of ways of saying the same thing in a human communication language, there are many ways of doing the same thing in a programming language. And when I give you an assignment, 20 students in a class will probably each program it differently because we all think differently, we write differently, we use different variable names. And there's often more than one way of doing that same thing. We might use a while loop, we might use a for loop to accomplish perhaps the exact same task. So while the statements that we use are exacting, the way we put those together in a larger block is not necessarily so, and our logic can be different between us. Here I have the idle editor running on the right-hand side, and then I've created a new file over here, which I have not saved yet, so it's named untitled. And I'm going to write a few statements here, and then we'll save it and execute it and see the execution run over here. So as I mentioned, we have keywords, and print is one of those keywords. And I can say print, in parentheses and in quotes, hello, Python students. Now I mentioned syntax. And the print statement always has a set of parentheses. And here we are printing what's called a literal string. I can type anything in here that I want to print, but it has to be inside quotes. And the quotes tell Python this is a literal string, and therefore ignore anything that's in those quotes because you, the computer, are not going to understand it. Don't even try to decipher what this means. Just print this statement. Print this literal string. So I'm going to go to the File menu and just simply choose Save As. And I'll just call this Print Demo. And I'll save this. So now I'm going to go to the Run menu and choose Run Module. And you'll see that it prints out Hello Python Students. We're going to look more at the print statement here in a minute, but I also want to show you comments. Every statement we write is going to be interpreted by this Python idle shell. Python is not a compiled program. We're not going to get binary code, but every time we run our program and load it in here, it's going to go through each line and interpret that and do whatever we're telling it to do. And it can go through hundreds of lines of code in mere seconds. So if I make a mistake here in my statement, as I said earlier, this is an exact thing. If I leave out the parenthesis, save my program and try to run it, I get an error. Expected EOF. EOF means end of file while parsing. Okay, so that was because I left out my parenthesis. What if I leave out a quote? And I'm getting end of line while scanning string literal. It couldn't find the end of that string literal. Okay, but what if I get rid of both quotes? I'm going to save it, Control S, F5 to run, and I get invalid syntax. The interpreter is trying to figure out what Python means. So it's exact in that sense. I'm going to restore my quotes here. But sometimes I want to put things in my code that the computer is not going to understand. I don't necessarily want them printed out here. So we can create what's called a comment. And a comment is done with a hashtag or a pound sign and a space. And then anything I write after that, the interpreter is going to ignore. So I can say this is a comment by your professor. I'm going to save my program again, Control S, F5 to run. And all I'm getting is hello Python students. It's not doing anything with this line of code. Oftentimes, I will put comments in terms of maybe the name of the program. So let's say this is the paycheck calculator that we're going to write. So I put that in as a comment. I will often put my name as the developer. And then maybe who my client was. And maybe the date that this was created. I'm going to add another print statement. We'll say this is way cool. And I can also put comments after statements. This will print information. So I might put a comment after a statement to remind myself what that statement is supposed to do. Remind myself of what was I thinking when I wrote this program. What was my logic? Or I might define what a variable means. Again, I'm going to save and run. And now I'm getting hello Python students, this is way cool. So it printed this line, ignored all my comments, did the print statement on this fifth line, and ignored that comment. Now sometimes you'll write code and you might experiment with some things and you have a statement that you want to try getting rid of, but you don't really want to delete it because you may actually want to come back and use it. So a simple thing you can do to have a statement not be used is you can just simply comment it out. So again, I'm going to save, run, and all I'm getting is hello Python students. In some languages, we have what's called block comments. And Python does not have a block comment. You simply have to put a hashtag in front of each line or each statement of your comment. However, some editors may have ways of commenting out multiple lines of code. Now, if I leave this as this is a comment by a professor, paycheck calculator, this is going to generate a whole bunch of errors. But I can take those three lines and I can come into format and choose comment out region, and it adds two hashtags in front of each line that I had selected. Now it simply puts a double hashtag as a visual clue that this was a comment added through the editor. If I want to get rid of those, I could highlight, go to format, and choose uncomment region. And it gets rid of those double hashtags. I'm going to do Control Z a bunch of times here to kind of get back to where I originally had, where I had my own comments in here. Notice the comments are in red, key statements are in purple, literal strings are in green. So Python color codes stuff for us. And you can actually adjust the color coding. I recommend for now you stick with it so you can easily tell my code, how I've written things and how you're writing things as you follow along in my projects. So that's comments and that's printing. Let's look at a few more things we can do with printing. Literal strings in Python are defined with double quotes. They can also be defined with single quotes. Again, I'm going to save and run. And now I'm getting, hello Python students, this is way cool. I can also use single quotes. So it doesn't care if you use double quotes or single quotes as long as you're consistent on each line. I can't do a single quote and then a double quote. And the reason for that is I might want to have a single quote or double quote in my print statement. So here I'm going to say this is highlighted information, and I'm going to highlight it by putting this word in quotes. I want those double quotes to show up, so what I need to do is have single quotes around my string. Actually, before I save it and do it, let's do the opposite. And so here, welcome to SMCC in double quotes, but SMCC is in single quotes. It will treat those quotes in both of these statements, whether it's double quotes or single quotes, as part of the literal string. So again, I'm going to save, I'm going to run. And so here we've added this. This is highlighted information by putting the quotes around highlighted, and then welcome to SMCC is in single quotes. I'm going to show you another way to do this, and that is using what we call escape characters. And escape characters are defined as a backslash and some character. So here I have a backslash and a single quote in front of highlighted and after highlighted, but my whole string is defined by single quotes. But with the backslash in front of these two, it will treat those as single quote characters and not the end of our string. Once again, I'm going to save and run. And here you can see this is highlighted information with single quotes. Now I'm going to do another escape character, and that is a backslash n. And this is the character for called a new line character. It creates a new line of our print. It's going to print it on the next line. Once again, I'm going to run. And notice now I get this is highlighted with information on the next line. There's another special character, and that's a backslash t, which is the tab. I'm going to run that, and notice that it puts any tab character between this is and highlighted. Well, maybe I want to print quotes. So I could add quotes around this whole thing. If I wanted to guarantee, though, that wasn't messing up with a string, I might want to put in escape characters here as well. Because this is, we have a backslash single quote, we have a backslash double quote. Lost my T there. So I'm going to again save and run. And so now I'm getting the double quote. This is highlighted around single quotes, information, double quote. Here I've added the phrase South Mountain Community College to be printed, but with new line characters between South and Mountain, between Mountain and Community, and between Community and College. And when I run that, I get those four words on separate lines. Now we can also do print, and if I do 3 quotes. This will allow me to do formatting in terms of spacing and white space within my statement. So here I can do South, Mountain. I'm going to go over a few spaces here. Community. And we'll come back over and say college. And I'm going to close with 3 quotes in my parentheses. And again, Control S to save, F5 to print. And here you can see those last 4 lines. South Mountain Community College was printed directly from here and maintained the spacing. So I have South Mountain Community College with just a backslash at the end of the first 3 lines. This is called a continuation line character. It simply says that the statement is continued on the next line. Let me run this and show you what we get. Control S, F5. It took those 4 statements, so those 4 lines, and created one print statement out of it. One line that says South Mountain Community College. Doesn't print the backslashes. The backslashes simply tell Python that this literal string is continued on the next line. Oh, that one's continued on the next line, and that one's continued on the next line. So I have 3 print statements, South Mountain Community College. When we save this and run, we'll see that it does those 3 all on 3 separate lines of output. And so it adds a new line character at the end of a print statement by default. However, I can add what we call a parameter here. And I can say end equals quote, quote. And I'm going to do that on the next line as well. I need to add a comma, and then end equals quote, quote. And what that says is rather than using a new line character at the end of this print statement, I want you to use basically a null string, just quote, quote. It doesn't matter whether we use single quotes or double quotes. Let me save this now and run it. And notice I'm getting South Mountain Community College. And community colleges all runs together there because there's no spaces. So as you're putting output together, you want to be aware of things like spaces. Sometimes you want to literally add them in. So now I'm getting it nicely spaced. Or I could also say I want to do the end as a literal space. And I get the same thing. So rather than using a new line character, it's using a single space. And if I put several spaces in here and run it, notice it gives me several spaces after the end of that line. One more special escape character. So I'm going to say the backslash looks like this. And I'm getting an error because it's treating this as a literal character, backslash quote. Okay, well if I put a period there, and that actually worked. Maybe I don't want a period though. So how can I get around that? Well, there also is a backslash is an escape character for the backslash character. And now I will get this backslash looks like this with no period. So our special characters are \n for new line, \t for tab, and then our \, single quote, double quote, and a double backslash. One more thing that's kind of cool. We'll look more at printing in a future video when we start working with the variables and how to print those variables and format those variables. But one thing that's really cool is I can take a character. I'm just going to take a uppercase X. The multiplication operator in Python, as well as pretty much every other programming language, is an asterisk. So I'm going to do an asterisk, and then I'm going to say 20. And let's watch what happens when I save and run. I get 20 X's. Well, that's pretty cool. And I can do any character here I want. Maybe I want to do a hyphen. Or I can actually do multiple characters. Let's do this. I'm going to do a hyphen, asterisk, hyphen. I'm going to save my program and run it. And notice I get 20 hyphen, asterisk, hyphens strung together. And we'll conclude with concatenation. We're going to do more stuff on concatenation later. But concatenation is nothing more than a fancy word of adding strings together. So I'm going to kind of go back to that South Mountain. And the concatenation operator is the plus sign. We're adding strings together. Now I put a space after South and a space after Mountain. And I'm just going to abbreviate this one CC. We'll save and print. And notice I get South Mountain CC put together as one string. Now there's one last way of doing this, and that is if I use commas with strings. So I've got 3 separate strings here. I'm not going to put a space in. I'm going to save and run, and I get the exact same thing. So by separating strings in a print statement with commas, it by default puts a space between the strings.